Does rehab equal training? I think they're two different contexts, but at the same time, they have similarities. And I did that. I was like, when I took some of these courses, I was all in. I was just, everything was an asymmetrical pelvis, everything. You know what I mean? Like I was looking for it. You and I may take the same course, but we may take away different aspects from it because of the way that we think, the way that we process information, our experiences, our environments. Try making a decision just thinking of complexities theory. Like you can't, it's not possible. It's like everything is wrong if you think in terms of complexity theory. Like there's going to be no discussion, there's going to be no solutions. Gravity is this constant force that's trying to crush us into the ground. And so we have to compensate and change our body positions in order to manage that.
All right, Alex, welcome to the podcast. How you doing, man?
Hey, I'm good, Sean. Really appreciate you for having me.
It's a pleasure. Can you please tell us a little bit about yourself for those who don't know you yet?
Yeah, so my name's Alex Effer. I'm an exercise physiologist and strength conditioning coach out of Toronto, Canada. Long-winded, or the short-winded story is, I started in the field. When I was a kid, I really enjoyed playing sports, and I played everything. I played hockey, rugby, soccer, every sport that you can think of. And so I really gained a passion for understanding how the body moves. And it wasn't until I got injured playing hockey, where I was checked from behind and, I really messed up my knee, that I really started to appreciate how the body moves and understanding the training and making the body more resilient, as well as the rehab associated with it, where I then started to dive deeper into understanding, strength conditioning and rehab. But, when you read strength conditioning material, I mean, this is about 20 years ago, right? When you're starting to read those materials, it's very much so like it was just lift heavy weights all the time, and that was it, irrespective of movement and movement quality. And so you start to read those things and you're like, okay, I understand this, but then you're getting rehab for an injury, and you see that the therapists are really focused on the movement, and in that time it was a lot more isolated movements. And so that also didn't make a lot of sense to me, because you see these people who are injured but still lifting heavy weight. And so for me, it was trying to understand how both of them came together. And so from that, I did a bachelor's in kinesiology, and I did postgraduate studies in exercise physiology. And when I did that, I really started to understand, or bridge the gap between, movement and rehab and training, and how, it's not so much a spectrum, rather it should be something that we're working towards at the same time. And rehab should look like training. Training should have an element of rehab. Does it equal training? Does rehab equal training? I think they're two different contexts, but at the same time, they have similarities. Like if you're really trying to produce force or max effort, I mean, you need to really just bear down and push the weight and not focus on, putting pressure to the inside of your foot or these internal cues, but really try to move the weight. But when we're trying to learn a new movement, that's when we need to be a little more conscious. And so, I worked in a bunch of different clinics. I worked in a neurological clinic, working with stroke, MS, Parkinson's, where I really started to appreciate the nervous system's influence on movement. And then I started working with professional athletes, and I was working in the University of Toronto, which is considered to be like a Division I school in Canada. I mean, we don't have a lot of funding for sports, so sports isn't a huge thing within the universities, but we still had a great training facility. But through there, my main role was making sure that the athletes weren't getting hurt. So they're doing a strength conditioning program, making sure that they were periodizing the movements and the fitness qualities to make sure that, they're also becoming resilient, while also bridging the gap between the rehab therapist as well as the strength conditioning coaches. So we had a dialogue between them, because and I think like when I first got there, and even a little bit before, there was a lot of division between the two fields. And I still think that in our industry, there is a lot of division between rehab and strength conditioning, just because, again, like I said, like some therapists, not all, I think it's getting much, much better, but some therapists think that strength conditioning coaches are meatheads, and strength conditioning coaches think that therapists are too soft, so to say. But that's not the case. Like, both of them have great qualities, and I think we just need to meet more in the middle. And once we have that type of communication and that dialogue, we're going to get better as an industry. But so I left the university, started working at a clinic, and I worked there for about 2 years, where I was, bringing in a new type of training and rehab, because that's really what I do in Canada as an exercise physiologist. I work with two hats: the rehab route, where I work with a lot of people who are in persistent pain or chronic pain. They've experienced injuries for a long period of time, and then I take them and make them resilient by reinforcing strength conditioning on top of that. And, but reinforcing the movement patterns through different implements, whether that's velocity or whether that's, lifting heavier weights or that's capacity, whatever it is, like we're taking them through that spectrum. And now I work for myself. I started my own company, Resilient Training and Rehabilitation, which is about 2.5 years now. And ever since the pandemic, obviously because a lot of people have had to pivot and adapt, I moved a lot more online, and I work now. I opened a Resilient Education, which essentially I do mentorships and really try to present my model on how I perceive movement and my lens of movement, and how we can apply it to not just rehab, but also to strength conditioning. And so I do a lot of online education, online training now, which I love and I hope to continue to do.
Yeah, that's awesome. And in terms of, you building out your own model and really figuring out how all those things work, I know you have a background, education and PRI, DNS. What for you were the most influential people when it came to maybe the foundational pillars of your current model of how you approach rehab and SNC as well?
Yeah. So I left out one part where there was a time in between that my entire career so far where I didn't have a job for about 9 months. And I left a facility just because I wasn't really happy with how they were managing things. And, they saw clients as a dollar sign rather than as people. And so I didn't really, mesh well with that kind of perception or that kind of perspective. And so I took the 9 months, and instead of just getting a random job, what I did is I doubled down on my education. As you said, I took the 3 primary PRI courses within 3 months, right? I did one each month and really went deep into it. Yeah, it's very heavy, very intense. But luckily what I did is I also listened to Mike Robertson's podcast when he had Mike Roncarati on. And Mike Roncarati is, at the time, he was the director, I think, of rehab for the Atlanta Hawks. So he was in town playing the Toronto Raptors, the NBA team. And I just reached out to him. I just said, hey, I'm taking these courses. I really don't, I'm trying to figure it out. I'm trying to figure out how I can use it without just doing breathing exercises on my back, because a lot of my clients don't like that, especially considering the fact that a lot of my in-person clients are pretty, they're in the finance industry. And so, which are pretty compressed people and pretty high stress people, but you tell them to lie on their back and do a breathing exercise. They're like, why am I doing this? This is ridiculous. I want to move. I want to get up and I want to train. I'm like, okay. So he had taken it for a long time. Like he had taken it about 6 years prior or something. And so he was really well-versed in it and really understood how to apply it. And so I credit a lot of my initial thought process to that, how to integrate it so that it's not just, when you take some of these courses, it's not just using their exercises, but how to take those principles behind the exercises and apply it to things like lunging and squatting. And so I took the PRI and I did that, and that's amazing. It's a huge influence on my initial perception. Then I wanted to dive deeper into DNS because that was the thing. I really enjoyed their approach to how, you know, you can use the neurological reflexes that we innately have through our progression as a baby to training. But the caveat is that, as people know at this point, babies have heavier heads. And so we don't move like babies, despite the fact that they have this perfect squat, perfect movement. We aren't like them. We have different body structures. We have more constraints. Babies are developing their ligaments and their passive constraints, like their ligaments and tendons. They're looser than when we're integrating and as we get older. And so I didn't like their assessment process, to be honest, but I really like how they organize their exercises based on the different levels against gravity and changing levels, which essentially is just dropping your center of gravity down in a squat. I really, really enjoy that aspect. And I also dove into some FRC, because all these courses were really talking about the outside perspective and seeing how things integrate together through breathing and through gait. And what I really like about FRC is they took it into the joint and looked at how we have these mechanoreceptors that modulate our movement and allow us to sense the world around us. And the fact that our mechanoreceptors, inside of our joint, they control 95% of rotation. And so essentially what I mean by that is internal and external rotation accounts for 95% of the information that goes to our brain. Flexion, like the sagittal plane and the frontal plane, that's only 5%. And so that means that those movements are very important for movement. And it makes sense when we get hurt, when we get stiff, those are the first things to lock up. The really stiff people have no internal or external rotation, but they can get away with some flexion and some adduction and abduction. So I started to incorporate all of that. And then I started diving deeper into, at the clinic I was working at, I worked with a lot of osteopaths. And depending on where you are in the world, there's different osteopaths. Like Australian osteopaths are different than Canadian osteopaths, which are different than the osteopaths in the US. And the Canadian osteopaths, they really focus on how the internal organs and how the systems internally integrate to form movement. And so it was really cool to gain that perspective as well. And they put a lot of emphasis on breathing. They put a lot of emphasis on how fluid moves in our body, whether that's lymph, whether that's our organs shifting side to side, causing our pelvic floor and our diaphragm to change their shape.
Do you feel like, sorry to cut you off, do you feel like that gets a little bit closer to what Bill Hartman is talking about those days in terms of his model of movement?
Absolutely, yeah. And Bill Hartman has been a huge influence on me as well. Bill Hartman, Mike Robertson, people at IFAST, but absolutely. I think if you look at a lot of what he's doing, it's very embryological, like how the baby forms in the body. And, essentially there's certain parts of our body that form at the same time, which means they move similarly. Like our rib cage and our pelvis were formed very close together, right? So our sternum, our sacrum, again, other parts are formed together. So they move very similarly in our body. And so absolutely, I think a lot of the things that he's talking about, even PRI, is very osteopathic, because osteopathy was one of the original practices for rehab and for looking at the movement. And so, yeah, absolutely. I think he definitely has a huge influence on that, especially the pelvic floor anatomy and how the guts move. And are those things important? I don't think we can measure how the internal organs move. And so are we manipulating the organs? I don't think we really know what's happening, but it helps to visualize what's happening. If I'm, especially with pelvic, it's very important for pelvic floor, because people have pelvic floor issues, which are related to, not being able to manage pressure. And you can define pressure in whatever way you want. But part of that is when I breathe in, the guts get pushed down to my pelvic floor. So my pelvic floor has to descend and accept it. And so some people, and how does that apply to performance? Well, some people who can't accelerate or they can't jump back up, they can land, but they can't re-accelerate up, they may have a hard time shifting those internal forces, those internal volumes up. Or if you think about the pelvic floor as like a trampoline, your guts go down, they hit the bottom, and then they shoot back up as I contract or as I internally rotate. So yeah, I definitely think that Bill Hartman has a lot of, embryological influence, osteopathic influence. And I personally think that PRI is predominantly osteopathic. I
Mm.
mean, there's some dentistry sprinkled in, there's some, vision sprinkled in, as well as some physiotherapy and stuff like that. But if you really look at the osteopaths and the way they talk, like Leon Chaitau, he talks really about breathing and gait as being the fundamental principles of movement and how everything integrates. And so I started looking at all these models that are being presented. Even I did SFMA as well, because I really liked how they organized things in a system and like the difference between active and passive movements. But when you start to see with all these principles, all these systems, is certain patterns emerge. And everything came back to gait, breathing, and how they influence all the movement in our body. And then what we can do is we can manipulate these principles, form them into exercises, and then we change range of motion in our body.
Through that education process that you went through, what were your biggest light bulb moments, or the biggest things that you had to change your mind about as you went on and learned new things?
I think I went through different transition points in terms of what I thought was important. So I think everybody who starts in this industry, maybe not everybody, I can't talk for everybody, but for me, I started thinking about like getting jacked and like all about muscles and like, I got to train this muscle this way. And then I started to move away from that. And I went into the functional movement stuff. And that was like, okay, we need to train functional movement patterns. Muscles are useless. They're not important. And then I started diving into that stuff, but then I realized is that all of it's important. And I started thinking more muscles as compressors of the body rather than just things that we just like isolate in their movement. So it's a combination of all of them. I think all the fads that have come through, I don't think they're wrong. I just think that people are very isolated in their thinking. It's like muscle-based training is the best, or functional-based training is the best. There's some people who just wonky functional-based training. And like that stuff is a little bit weird to me. But I kind of understand why they're doing it. They're trying to use gait patterns in order to do it. But I think one of the biggest things that I tried to do was I had these clients who had this preconceived notion of what training and rehab is. And it's like, I got to meet them where they are. I can't just be like, okay, all that stuff that you know is wrong. All that stretching and strengthening is wrong. You need to do this breathing stuff on your back. And I did that. I was like, when I took some of these courses, I was all in. I was just, everything was an asymmetrical pelvis, everything. Like, you know what I mean? Like I was looking for it. And like, that's also one of my major things is that everybody had an asymmetrical pelvis. Everybody had limited internal rotation on their right. And so there was a point where, I was pretty foolish. Like I wouldn't even assess some people. I'm like, yeah, you're probably that. So we're just going to do this. And some people didn't work. Like some people defied some of these systems. And then I'm like, well, it's not, it can't be all encompassing because the body's so complex. Everybody comes from different backgrounds. So I then, between a mixture of failures, stuff not working with people, having to find different ways of doing things, mixed with some of my clients saying, I'm not doing that. And I'm like, okay, well, I have to adapt. And so what I did is I just said, okay, well, like I said, these principles of breathing and gait, they can be applied to squatting, lunging, pressing, whatever it is. And we can categorize exercises based on these phases of gait and based on these phases of breathing, so that now people can do a lunge, but I can just modify the lunge. Maybe I do a rear foot elevated split squat with one person and I do a heels elevated split squat with another person, because I'm trying to influence their pelvic position and trying to give them what they don't have. But they don't know what's happening. They just think that they're training and they think it's very hard. But for me, I'm giving them what they need and what they want, right? And so I think that I kind of jumped around, and I think it's very important. I think you have to be open to learning so that your beliefs change. And I think one thing, the biggest change I've made is that I don't have a system that I believe to be, or a model that I believe to be correct, because I don't think there is any model that's correct. I think based on the information we have now, we can be more accurate, and combining parts of every system and understanding the patterns that emerge within them. It's like, okay, breathing and gait, those are the fundamentals for all of them. They just go about it different ways. And you get more effective results by understanding how these different phases of gait and different phases of breathing change the joints within your body, change the muscle contraction bias. And then you can start getting creative with your assessment, and where you're looking at, what does this person have? Not an algorithm in your head that says, okay, this person, I expect this person to have this, so I'm just going to do this. It's like, no, you now have more variability, and you have an assessment process that actually gives you the true representation of what this person has.
I want to go full macro with you for a second. We'll come back to all these really fascinating topics in a minute, but I'm thinking about, let's say, the advancement of the field as a whole, and I know you do some mentoring and consulting as well with coaches. So from your standpoint, is it better for each and every coach to go out and seek out all those different streams of education to then bring back and try to find some unifying underlying maybe principles that they can use to move forward? Or should the field more move towards maybe coaching, collaborating more with other coaches that have respective strength in different disciplines to then bring that kind of a unified approach, but with multiple practitioners in the process? What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the coolest thing that's emerged, I mean, the pandemic's terrible for, it's caused a lot of issues for a lot of people, but within our industry, one of the cool things that have emerged from it is the accessibility to education. I mean, look, I'm in Canada, you're in Switzerland, and we're able to communicate and talk. Like, it's amazing. It's brought the world closer together in terms of communication. But you see a lot of, whether it's trainers or therapists, coming out and talking about how they have accumulated all this knowledge and how they put it together and get success with their clients. And so now, instead of going to a course and like trying to learn a model and like, okay, well, how do I apply this? Like, there's no context. You are now, talking to somebody who has been through the failures and tried to apply them and said, hey, I've taken all these systems. These are the things that I have found to be more successful than not. And so now you skip steps, right? And you say, hey, well, maybe I'll focus on this because it's more important. And then what you can do is start to focus based on your context and the population you work with. You can dive deeper into certain topics, but you've created this framework, this foundational framework. That's what I try to do with my Evolve mentorship, is bring them like a foundational system and be like, hey, this is how the body moves, how the body works. These are the principles. If you want to talk more about fascia and how and see how that applies, go read books about fascia. What you're going to see is the same principles are going to apply. Because I didn't just take these systems. Like, I've read all about fascia, I've read all about neurology, all about embryology and stuff, and everything follows the same fundamental principles. So to answer your question, I think it's important for people to take courses and learn from the source, but I think it's just as important to talk to people that they respect. Just like I did, I reached out to Mike because I'm like, I really liked what you said. It's kind of what I'm thinking and where I want to be, where I want to go with things. You have learned it. You've done it. Can you help me figure this stuff out and explain to me how you use this information so that I can get a better idea of how to use it. So I'm not just following the prescription or following how they do things in their systems, which they do it. Like, there's nothing wrong with them at all, but like, you know, there's no system that's complete. Can't be. The body's way too complex. It's the reason why there's people who dedicate their entire lives specializing into one aspect of the body, and they still don't know, right? So we as movement professionals, whether we're therapists or trainers, like, we just have to seek out as many people as we can, gain as many perspectives as we can, because not only are we, you know, you and I may take the same course, but we may take away different aspects from it because of the way that we think, the way that we process information, our experiences, our environments. And so it's important to have these conversations with as many people as possible so that you can hear perspectives of how people utilize information. But I think definitely, you know, from a macro perspective, I think if we communicate more as an industry, then we're going to be a lot better off. I mean, again, one of the other reasons why and you probably have the same issue, is one of the reasons why one of my biggest problems with education was that there's nobody who comes to Canada for continuing education. So I have to fly to the States, or I had to go to Europe or anything like that. And so I just wanted, I created the mentorship to make it so that, you know, it doesn't matter where you're from, you have access to the same information. And so I hope to see that progresses, that, you know, it's not just in-person stuff, but I think in-person's important because we get to network and get to, you know, engage with people. But I hope that it continues where there's more online education, just so we can, you know, make it more accessible.
Talking about perspective and incomplete models, from your experience in consulting with elite sports, what is usually missing from those high-level performance programs that, from what you see and know now as a kind of a holistic approach to movement and performance?
I think so. I've dealt with a couple people, some people in professional baseball, some people in professional basketball, and so I'll talk based on my experience. I think one of the biggest things, and it's across every domain. I think everybody is emotional about the model that they use, the system that they use, and, you know, I think we need to be more open in terms of what system we use. Like, there's some organizations that abide by the principles of this particular system, and like everything is this system. Like, we use the system through and through. Like, that's it. Again, I think integration is key. I think we need to. I get a lot of people who reach out to me because my model doesn't. I can't think of a better word than like poo-poo. Like, it doesn't, like, you know, bring other models down. It more so says, hey, everything is probably right. Everything works. Every exercise, there's no inherently bad exercise, no inherently bad assessment model or modality that you use. But there's pieces that work better, and they just reinforce the things that, you know, we're talking about here, right? And so I think if we come about it as more, you know, like, to me, I just go about saying that, you know, gait and breathing are fundamental to every single movement. So start there. Don't start learning about don't start looking at things from a superficial perspective. Like, okay, we're just going to talk about muscles. Then we're just going to talk about joints. We're just going to talk about fascia. It's like, there's a lot of things that are going on inside, right? Like, if you think about it, when I breathe in, I expand from the inside out, which means muscles will then have to relax on the outside. So I talk about, you know, an inside out perspective rather than an outside in perspective, but we need to know both. We need to be reductionist at certain times. We need to be generalist at other times. We need to go back and forth. We need to zoom in, zoom out. And I think a lot of, not just professional organizations, I think there's some people who definitely need to take a step back and reevaluate their model, and progress it rather than say, well, this is what I've done for 10 years and it's worked. It's like, well, it can always be improved. Information comes out and can always be adapted. But I think sometimes also people live in the world of complexity, and it's like any sense of simplifying is bad. It's like, oh, well, you're not appreciating complexity. It's like, look, I've read all about dynamic systems theory. I've read all about these systems theory. It's like, try making a decision just thinking of complexity theory. Like, you can't. It's not possible. It's like everything is wrong if you think in terms of complexity theory. Like, there's going to be no discussion. There's going to be no solutions. So we simplify in order to understand complexity. We just have to appreciate complexity. If we simplify too much, we will then negate our acceptance of complexity, and then we're going to be wrong.
Do you feel like, sorry to cut you off, do you feel like that's maybe where younger coaches are more influential? Is that a word in English? Help me here.
Influential? Yeah, maybe. Influence? Yeah.
Can be,
I don't even know.
Can be influenced by maybe a single perspective or a single model because it brings, like you said, some simplicity to the complexity of the human body that is still unfathomable for all of us. We'll never understand it fully. And maybe that's why they stay stuck in those camps and have a hard time stepping out. And because, again, stepping out of a comfort zone is saying, I'm not sure, I don't know, and I might be wrong. And that's uncomfortable for lots of people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, for younger coaches, I mean, the body's so complex. Like, where do you start? You know what I mean? It's like, it's so overwhelming. And the amount of information continues to increase. It's just like, what's important to learn? And so what they do is they follow a few people, and then those people's models and those people's beliefs and opinions now become their own. And so they just focus on that. I mean, look, in school, you're taught about the anatomy, but without any context. So like, what I mean is, like, you learn about, okay, the bicep attaches to here, but you don't see how that relates to gait, how that relates to movement. And so, you kind of just dismiss it. Like, I did terrible in anatomy in university, like it was not a good course for me at all. Like, I almost failed. But I would say that my anatomy right now is so much better. And honestly, ever since I took, a course like PRI or DNS, where they talk about how muscles are triplanar and not just like my bicep doesn't just flex my elbow in a sagittal plane, and how there's a lot of rotation going on, like, that's when it started making sense. I'm like, okay, when I'm watching somebody walk or when I'm watching somebody do a movement, I can see how it, how it can be integrated and how it can be useful. So I definitely think that younger coaches, it's probably very overwhelming to come into an industry where there's so much information about the body. And they focus on the camp based on the fact that they start by learning from a couple people. Sometimes they get overwhelmed because some people talk with big words. I mean, some people talk in the complexity, and I also don't like that, because when you do that, you are then alienating certain people, right? Do you know what I mean? Like, when you're changing an entire language just to convey your model, I think that's also when you become wrong. Or not wrong, but it's just not the greatest. It's not all inclusive for a lot of people. People coming in industry are starting to learn about eccentric, concentric, and isometric muscle actions, right? And then you're introducing an entire different language. You're like, well, that's probably not that accurate. Like, what the heck? Like, they feel overwhelmed, like they know nothing, and that's also wrong. So I think young coaches just need to reach out to people, be mentored by people who've been in the industry for a long period of time, but then take a bunch of different courses and create their own model. Literally what I did at the beginning of the pandemic was, I had the first 2 weeks, I had no clients. Everyone was like, what is going on? And my business was primarily in person. And so what I did at the beginning of the pandemic is I really wanted to do a lot of online stuff and a lot of online education. So I started to build that. But one thing I did is I took 5 pieces of paper, big piece of paper, put it on my table, and I started to do like a spider diagram of what my model is to understand myself. So if I were to present it, how could I present it in a way where people who are students, like I have some people take my mentorship who are physical therapy students, and I have other people who've been in the industry for 30 years. And both of them are learning something different because it's different perspective. But to break down a model like that is very important for any young person and somebody who's been in the field for a while to really put down their thoughts and really be like, okay, well, this is the area that I'm not the greatest at. So I'm going to focus on that. One area for me was I didn't know much about the foot at all. And so I just dove deep into it. I just read only things for 3 months about the foot. Like that's it. I didn't read about anything else, just the foot. So I can deep dive myself into it so I can really understand the ins and outs of it so I can apply it. So I think for younger people is they need to write down what they know, what they believe, and then then you're going to see like, what do I need to focus on more? And then who can I seek out to do that?
Yeah, it's funny. I was just chatting with Evan Picon before we hopped on, and we were talking about building out models. And the thing that came up was Pat Davidson's recent book, where he literally just writes out everything that he's learned so far, which is for any coach out there. I don't know if you read it, but it's a fantastic book.
Very good.
Yeah. And I think that might be a great starting point for people who are looking for, okay, how do I get the overall picture without being overwhelmed by having to go to, like you said, 100 different certifications and seminars, and actually have a base to work from. And then, like you said, assess maybe your shortcomings as a coach, and then go and seek out that information, right?
Yeah, well, I wish the information or the people who were presenting stuff like Pat Davidson and people doing mentorship, I wish that existed when I first got in the industry, because it would have given me direction. I was like reading everything I could get my hands on, and it was a bunch of random information. Like I think I was following like 50 people. And so I was just trying to understand all these people. And then what I did is I took a step back and I'm like, who are these people constantly referencing? So then I just removed 25 of them. And who are those people referencing? I moved another 10. And then I boiled it down to 5 to 10 people. And then now I really, I get my information from, again, 5 to 10 people, and then from other books and, what they recommend reading, and communication or talking to people in the industry. Like I'm on Instagram all the time because I'm talking to people all the time. Like I'm talking to other coaches, other therapists, and, they're like, hey, what do you think of this? And I bounce back ideas on them. And like, that's the best thing you can do. But to get a book like, Pat Davidson's, or take a mentorship from somebody, to have a starting point, then that allows you to then write out your model and be like, okay, I have the starting point because now I have a little bit of information, a little bit of context as to what people are doing in this industry and how they are doing it. Not just talking and beating around the bush, but actually saying, hey, these are some case studies. This is exactly what I did. This is why I did it. This is how I did it. And talking about how to do that, then they can get some reference and be like, okay, well, these people recommend I read these books. One of the things I did in the beginning of the industry was I went to people I respected at the beginning of the industry. The people I learned from were, Bill Hartman, Mike Robertson, Eric Cressy, Mike Boyle, like some of those big names. And I literally went on their websites and I'm like, do they recommend any readings? And I read every single book they recommended, right? Because I'm like, these people are where I want to get in terms of my information or in terms of my knowledge and the way that I do things. So it's probably best that I read the things that they read in order to understand why they got to what they did, but not to be like them, but to understand the information they have and put my own spin on it. And so that's what I found very important at the beginning.
Is there a couple books maybe that come to mind as being hugely influential on you through the years? I know you've probably read hundreds, but if you on the spot, if you had to think of a couple that really maybe solidified some things for you, or maybe even shifted perspectives for you.
So early on, I'll say early on, and then I'll say some now. Early on, I would say one of the biggest influence, like a few of them were Shirley Sarman's book, Movement, and I think Diagnosis. I can't remember what it's called, but Shirley Sarman, anything she's written. just because she was really the one that, you know, made me think differently from just an isolated joint movement perspective, and saying, hey, this joint can affect this joint, right? And like how there's like this, not necessarily like a joint by joint, but like different aspects, and how different parts of the body can influence each other, and really deep diving into the mechanics of the body and how they apply to movement and how they can influence pain, or influence injury. So Shirley Sarman, Leon Chaitau's book, Recognizing and Treating Breathing Disorders, was really great, because it just talks about how breathing can be integrated into multiple different systems. Like they have a thing about singers, Pilates, strength conditioning coach, like that was huge. And then honestly, for categorizing exercises, Mike Boyle's earlier books were huge for me, just because I was able to systemize things a little bit better and be like, okay, I'm starting to create a system, and now every course that I go to, I can now put and fill these systems, fill the gap in terms of, or just plug and play, right? So again, I was trying to create a system where if I took this course, they all came back to the same system. So Leon Chaitau, Shirley Sarman, Mike Boyle were pretty influential in terms of the books. Now, I would say, I can't remember his name, his first name, his last name is Scar, but Biotensegrity, the book Biotensegrity is huge. Like, to me, it's one of the best books I've read, only because it talks about how we change shape, in terms of the fact that when I breathe in, I externally rotate, essentially systemically. When I exhale, I internally rotate systemically. And what that does, that changes the shape of the foot, pronation or supination, that changes the position of the pelvis, that changes the position of the rib cage, that changes the position of the shoulder joints, and how we can influence the different structures in our body through tensegrity and through these different systems. But how there's an efficient shape within the body, and that is, or within nature and the universe, and that is through helical angles and through helixes, and how that's a very efficient shape. And if you look at muscle cells, you look at like sarcomeres, ligaments, everything in our body, they're arranged in these shapes in a bunch of triangles, which will then form helixes. And so that was really, really cool to try to bring those things together. I can't even remember his name. I'm terrible with names, but Schomburger's book, it's called The Malalignment Syndrome. That is huge, because it really talks about these asymmetrical positions and how those influence movements, and how those can influence pain or can influence asymmetries. And then last two, I would say Born to Walk by James Earl really is a great introduction into gait, and how gait changes joint positions and how they influence muscle contractility, and how we can start to integrate gait into training. And then Human Locomotion by Andrew Mashad, I think his name is. That's also a great book. It's a little more advanced, but it talks about how the tibia moves related to the foot, and how different phases of gait start to move. I mean, the concepts of like early, mid, and late propulsion that came from that book, right? Like that's where I first was introduced to some concepts like that. And so, yeah, no, I mean, so those are some of the big books. And then I would say, read those books, understand the X's and O's of movement, and then read outside the industry, because when you start to read outside the industry, you start to see that everything is the same. And I got a lot of ideas about putting together my model by reading inside the industry.
That makes sense. I know you have a coaching coming up pretty soon, Alex. So maybe since you mentioned that as really the underlying foundation of your model and the way you view things, could you give a let's try short 4 to 5 minute tops primer on gait and breathing from your perspective?
For sure. Yeah. So I always say to people that in order to survive, you need to breathe and you need to move. we move through Gait. You look at any type of anthropology, or there's a book that just came out by Daniel Lieberman called Exercise, which is awesome. But he's an anthropologist, and he talks about how he spent a couple months with hunter-gatherers and how they walked about 3 miles a day, but they walked in order to survive, in order to get food. And so it's a fundamental principle that we've evolved over human evolution. And so, but the cool thing that you start to see is that when people breathe in, as I said, everything externally rotates. Your pelvis externally rotates, femurs, your feet supinate, which is just foot external rotation. So think about standing on the outside of your feet. All that external rotation, that's related to expansion, inhalation. When you exhale, that's when you pronate your foot. That's when you internally rotate your hips. That's when you internally rotate your ribs. And so that is related to propelling. That is related to force, propulsion. That is related to like lifting heavy weights. We need to pronate. We need to internally rotate in order to contract out of the bottom of a squat. But we need to externally rotate to get to the bottom of the squat. We need to descend our pelvic floor, descend our diaphragm. And so by understanding that everything follows these two fundamental principles, we can really manipulate any exercise. When we assess people, somebody doesn't have external rotation, we can be like, well, this person has some type of compression or exhalation somewhere. We need to provide them with more inhalation, more expansion. Then we're going to recapture the external rotation, not by cranking through joint ranges of motion. Like if I don't have internal rotation, for example, like doing some type of stretch that forces internal rotation, like is that going to be a long-term effective strategy? It's like, no. Why don't you teach them like what causes a lack of internal rotation? Okay, you can talk about muscles, you can talk about all these different things, great. But what happens on the inside that influences it, that limits our internal rotation? Then we can start talking about breathing. We can start talking about managing pressures, because we really are managing internal pressures constantly, because gravity is this constant force that's trying to crush us into the ground. And so we have to compensate and change our body positions in order to manage that. So what you can do now is you can say gait and breathing are similar. They have similar strategies. We can now categorize exercises based on those strategies. If I want to do a box squat, I'm biasing more internal rotation just based on how the hips move within that 90 degrees, based on the orientation of muscles. For example, anterior glute med, it gains leverage as an internal rotator at 90 degrees. We start to pronate our foot. So I can bias now, okay, this person needs internal rotation, great. Box squats, rear foot elevated split squats, because that now loads the front leg and I have to propel and decelerate my weight so that I don't fall. But I bias internal rotation. When I bias external rotation, I could do a heels elevated squat. Or power lifters, they use heel lifts already. So great, they're biasing external rotation. But some of them are missing internal rotation. So maybe we get them out of those. And you start using those, I can't remember the brand name of the shoes that some people use to lift, but those flat foot shoes, like start using that to propel. But you can now categorize exercises based on that. And to me, that's what makes more sense. It's like what my biggest struggle was like, okay, I understand the different anatomy and the different structures and how the body moves. Okay. Then I had a problem. Then I focused my time on understanding how I could take the information from how the body moves and apply it to assessment so I can identify what movement they're missing as it relates to how the body works. It's like, okay, well, they're missing internal rotations. Like, what does that mean? Then I'm like, well, based on that, how do I select appropriate exercise? And that was my system that I transitioned throughout my career, and trying to understand each bucket, because it doesn't matter how much you know about the body or how much you know about assessment, unless you know how to use an exercise to gain the result, because the rest of it doesn't matter unless you can actually apply it and gain the results. And I think there's a lot of people in this industry who are very good with the theory, but applying it is a different story. A lot of people can educate people based on theory, but if you can't apply the information, I mean, it's not very helpful. And so I have found that everything relates back to expansion, compression, inhalation, exhalation, heel strike, mid stance, toe off of gait. And if we can categorize exercises and assessments based on that, it's going to be a lot simpler for us to apply, and we're going to get a lot better results.
Yeah, I like the way you talk about all that, Alex. I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today. If people want to learn more about what you do and what you offer in terms of education and mentorships, where can they find that?
Yeah, Sean, I really appreciate you having me. I really enjoy doing these things. So I host Evolve Mentorship, which talks about my model and how I apply it with clients and what I do on a daily basis. I have Evolve Mentorship, and I also have a couple courses going to be coming out that, again, applying the exercise aspect to it as well. That's going to be coming out in the next few months. But you can find me at my Instagram at my first name, Alex, last name, Effer. Or you can find me at my website, www.resilient.edu.com. But as I said, I'm a huge proponent of mentoring, so reach out if you have any questions. I'm always happy to answer.
Thanks for coming on the show, man.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sean. I really appreciate it.